Lilith, the forbidden queen of darkness. Close your eyes and imagine this. It's the dawn of creation, in a garden more perfect than any paradise you could dream of. Two beings stand beside each other, equals in every way, formed from the same earth, breathing the same air. But one of them refuses to bow. One of them demands equality. One of them says no to subjugation. And for that defiance, she is erased from history, demonized, turned into humanity's first villain. Her name is Lilith. And tonight, you're going to discover why the most powerful religious institutions in the world have spent thousands of years trying to make you forget she ever existed. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about the beginning, about Adam and Eve, about the Garden of Eden, about the very nature of good and evil. Because before Eve, there was another woman. A woman so dangerous, so threatening to the patriarchal order, that she had to be written out of the story. But here's what they couldn't erase: the whispers, the legends, the ancient texts that survived in the shadows. And what those texts reveal is absolutely mind-blowing. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Lilith represents the most suppressed narrative in Western civilization. You'll learn about ancient texts that religious scholars don't want you to read. You'll discover how one woman's refusal to submit became the blueprint for thousands of years of female demonization. And you'll see how Lilith's story has been secretly influencing art, literature, culture, and even modern feminism, all while hiding in plain sight. But I need to warn you, once you go down this rabbit hole, once you see how deeply Lilith's erasure is embedded in our cultural DNA, you can't unsee it. So if you're ready to have your mind blown, to question everything you thought you knew about ancient mythology and religious history, then stay with me. Because Lilith's story isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror reflecting our deepest fears about female power, sexuality, and autonomy. And it's more relevant today than ever before. Let's begin at the very beginning. The story you weren't told. The traditional narrative goes like this. God creates Adam from dust. Adam is alone. God decides it's not good for man to be alone. So he creates Eve from Adam's rib. She's literally made from a part of him, which establishes a hierarchy from the very beginning. She's derivative, secondary, made to be a companion, a helper. And then comes the serpent, the forbidden fruit, the fall from grace. We all know this story. It's been drilled into Western consciousness for millennia. But here's what they don't teach you in Sunday school. That's not the only creation story in Genesis. If you actually read the first chapter of Genesis carefully, there's something strange. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 says, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." Male and female, together, at the same time, from the same creative act. Equal. But then, if you keep reading into Genesis chapter 2, you get a completely different creation story. Suddenly, Adam is created first, alone. Then the animals are created. Adam names them all, but finds no suitable companion. Only then does God create Eve from Adam's rib. It's a totally different sequence of events. Two contradictory creation narratives in the same holy text. Why? This is where Lilith enters the picture. And this is where things get really interesting. The earliest explicit references to Lilith as Adam's first wife appear in the alphabet of Ben Sira, a medieval text from somewhere between the 8th and 11th centuries. But the roots of Lilith go back much, much further. Her name appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known works of literature, dating back to ancient Mesopotamia around 2100 BCE. She appears in ancient Sumerian texts as a class of demons or wind spirits. The ancient Babylonians knew her. The Assyrians feared her. She shows up in Jewish folklore, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, even in the Talmud. But it's in the alphabet of Ben Sira where we get the full story. And what a story it is. According to this text, Lilith was Adam's first wife, created at the same time as Adam, from the same earth. Not from his rib, not as an afterthought, as an equal. And this is crucial. She was made the exact same way Adam was made, which meant she saw herself as his equal in every way. And that's where the trouble started. The text describes a conflict between Adam and Lilith over, of all things, the position during sex. Adam wanted Lilith to lie beneath him. Lilith refused. She said, "Why should I lie beneath you when I am your equal, since both of us were created from dust?" It's such a simple statement, but it's revolutionary. She's asserting her equality, her bodily autonomy, her right to refuse. She's saying no. Adam, unable to handle this defiance, complains to God. And here's where Lilith makes her choice. Rather than submit, rather than give up her autonomy and equality, she does something extraordinary. She speaks the ineffable name of God, the true name of the divine that gives her the power of flight, and she flies away from Eden. She chooses exile over subjugation. She chooses freedom over paradise. Think about that for a moment. She gives up eternal life in paradise because she refuses to be dominated. God sends 3 angels to bring her back. Their names are Sinoi, Sansonoi, and Samangeloth. They find her by the Red Sea, in a place associated with demons and dark powers. They threaten her. They tell her that if she doesn't return, 100 of her children will die every day. Lilith refuses. Instead, she makes a counter-oath. She vows that she will have power over human infants, that she can harm them, but she promises not to harm any child protected by an amulet bearing the names of those 3 angels. And then comes the really dark part. Unable to return to Eden, unable to be with Adam, Lilith becomes something else entirely. The text describes her coupling with demons, with fallen angels, birthing hundreds of demonic children every day. She becomes the mother of demons, the queen of the night, a seductress who visits men in their sleep, stealing their seed to create more demon offspring. She becomes, in the eyes of the religious establishment, the ultimate evil woman, the prototype for every dangerous female figure that would follow. But here's the question we need to ask. Why? Why does refusing to be submissive turn Lilith into a demon? Why does demanding equality make her evil? Why does a woman's sexual autonomy transform her from the first woman into the first monster? The answer to that question reveals everything about how patriarchal religious structures have controlled the narrative about women for thousands of years. But before we get to that, we need to go even deeper into Lilith's ancient origins. Because this story is way older than medieval Jewish texts, Lilith's roots stretch back to the very dawn of civilization, and what we find there is absolutely fascinating. Let's travel back over 4,000 years to ancient Mesopotamia, to the cradle of civilization between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This is where writing was invented, where the first cities rose. The first complex mythologies were recorded in cuneiform script pressed into clay tablets. And this is where Lilith's story truly begins. In ancient Sumerian texts, we encounter a class of demons called the Lilu, and the feminine form, the Lilitu. These were wind spirits, storm demons, creatures associated with desolation and wilderness. But Lilith wasn't just any demon. In Sumerian mythology, there are references to Lilitu or Ki Sikil Lil La Ku, which some scholars translate as the maiden who howls or the screech owl. She was associated with barrenness, with infant mortality, with seducing men and causing nocturnal emissions. Now here's something important to understand about ancient demon mythology. Demons weren't necessarily evil in the way we think of evil today. They were forces of chaos, representatives of the wild and untamed aspects of existence. They existed outside the ordered structure of civilization and divine law, and often they were associated with female sexuality that existed outside male control. Unmarried women. Prostitutes. Women who refused traditional roles. These were the women who became associated with demonic forces. The most famous early depiction of Lilith is the Burney relief, also called the Queen of the Night relief. It's a Mesopotamian terracotta plaque from around 1800 to 1750 BCE. It shows a nude-winged goddess or demon with bird talons for feet, standing on two lions and flanked by owls. She wears a horned headdress, a sign of divinity in Mesopotamian iconography. For decades, scholars have debated whether this figure represents Lilith, or Ishtar, or Ereshkigal, or some other female deity or demon. But the iconography matches later descriptions of Lilith almost perfectly. The wings, the bird's feet, the association with owls and night, the dangerous, powerful feminine sexuality on full display. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest stories, there's a fascinating passage. The goddess Inanna has planted a sacred tree, hoping to make a throne and a bed from its wood. But the tree becomes inhabited by a serpent at its roots, the Anzu bird in its branches, and in the middle, Lilith makes her home. The hero Gilgamesh drives these creatures away, and Lilith flees to the wilderness. It's a brief mention, but it connects Lilith to sacred trees, to the Axis Mundi, to the connection between heaven and earth. Sound familiar? It should, because later, in Eden, there's also a sacred tree, a woman, and a serpent. The patterns repeat. As civilizations rose and fell, as empires conquered and cultures blended, Lilith traveled through the ancient Near East. The Babylonians knew her as a night demon who attacked pregnant women and infants. They created protective amulets inscribed with spells to ward her off. Archaeological excavations have uncovered these amulets, physical proof of how deeply Lilith was feared and believed in by ancient peoples. The ancient Hebrews, coming out of Babylonian captivity, brought these Lilith traditions with them. And this is crucial for understanding how she ended up connected to the Genesis story. The Jewish people absorbed and adapted the mythologies of the surrounding cultures, reinterpreting them through their own monotheistic framework. Lilith, the ancient Mesopotamian demon, gradually became integrated into Jewish folklore and mysticism. She appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls, those ancient Jewish texts discovered in caves near the Dead Sea. She's mentioned in the Songs of the Sage, a text about exorcisms and protection from evil spirits. She appears in early rabbinic literature, always in the context of danger to children and sexual threat to men. The Talmud mentions her, though not by name in some passages, referring to demons with long hair who seduce men in their sleep. But here's where it gets really interesting. Lilith appears in the Hebrew Bible itself. Just once, but it's there. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 34, verse 14, there's a passage describing the desolation of Edom, God's judgment turning the land into a wasteland inhabited by wild creatures. Different translations handle this verse differently. The King James Version translates it as the screech owl shall rest there. The New International Version says night creatures, but the original Hebrew word is Lilith. She's right there in the canonical text, associated with wilderness, desolation, and ruins. A creature of the wasteland, the places humans have abandoned, the chaos outside civilization's borders. This is the pattern we see repeated over and over. Lilith exists at the boundaries, between civilization and wilderness, between the ordered world of patriarchy and the chaotic realm of female autonomy, between life and death, between human and demon. She's a liminal figure, and that's precisely what makes her so powerful and so threatening. Now, fast forward to the medieval period, when Jewish mysticism is flourishing. This is when the Kabbalah is being developed, when Jewish scholars are creating elaborate mystical systems to understand the hidden meanings of Scripture and the nature of the divine. And this is when Lilith's role expands dramatically. In Kabbalistic texts, Lilith becomes an essential figure in the cosmic drama. She's not just a demon who threatens children. She becomes the consort of Samhael, the angel of death and the chief of the demons. Together, they rule over the Qliphoth, the realm of evil and impurity that exists as a dark mirror to the holy Sephiroth, the divine emanations that make up the Kabbalistic tree of life. Lilith becomes the queen of demons, a major figure in the cosmic battle between good and evil. The Zohar, the foundational work of Kabbalah written in the 13th century Spain, contains extensive passages about Lilith. It describes multiple Liliths, actually, a greater Lilith and a lesser Lilith, both emanations of the demonic feminine principle. These texts describe Lilith as eternally seeking to destroy the children of Eve, Adam's second, obedient wife. She's driven by jealousy and rage at being replaced. She seduces holy men to generate demonic offspring. She has the power to kill with a glance. She rules over a host of female demons, all variations of herself, all dangerous to men and children. This is also the period when the protective traditions around Lilith become elaborate and widespread. Jewish households would hang amulets in rooms where pregnant women slept and where infants lay in their cradles. These amulets bore the names of the three angels who pursued Lilith, Sinoi, Sansonoi, and Samangeloth, along with protective verses and magical symbols. They would write Lilith out, or protect this child from Lilith, on the walls of birthing rooms. They developed rituals and prayers for protection. And here's something really important to understand. This wasn't just superstition. For the people of medieval Europe and the Middle East, infant mortality was a constant, devastating reality. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of children died before the age of 5. Mothers died in childbirth regularly. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and sudden infant deaths, these were common tragedies that every family faced. In a world without modern medicine, without an understanding of bacteria, viruses, or genetic disorders, people needed an explanation for why babies died. They needed something to fight against, some way to protect their children. Lilith provided that explanation. She was the invisible enemy, the night demon who strangled infants in their sleep, who caused pregnant women to miscarry, who brought death into the nursery. And the amulets, the prayers, the rituals, these gave people a sense of control, a way to fight back, a psychological defense against the terror of child mortality. It's heartbreaking when you think about it. Generations of parents, desperate to protect their babies, invoked protection against a demon who represented their deepest fears. But here's what we need to understand. Yes, Lilith became a demon. Yes, she became associated with death and danger. But she began as something else. She began as a woman who said no. A woman who demanded equality. A woman who chose freedom over submission. Everything that came after, all the demonization, all the danger, all the evil, that was the response to her refusal. That was the punishment for her defiance. Think about the message this sends. A woman who refuses male dominance must be a demon. A woman who asserts her sexual autonomy must be aligned with evil forces. A woman who won't submit becomes a child killer, a seductress, a monster. This isn't just a story. It's a warning. It's a threat. It says to every woman who hears it, this is what happens when you refuse to obey. This is the price of autonomy. You will be cast out, demonized, turned into a cautionary tale. And this brings us to the most important question of all. Why was Lilith erased from the mainstream Genesis story? Why does almost nobody know about her? Why are we all taught about Adam and Eve, but not Adam and Lilith? The answer is both simple and profound. Lilith's story is too dangerous. It threatens the fundamental structure of patriarchal religion and society. Because if Lilith was Adam's equal, created the same way he was, with the same rights and the same authority, then the entire justification for male dominance crumbles. The whole system depends on Eve being made from Adam's rib, being created second, being created for him, as his helper. That's the origin story that justifies thousands of years of female subjugation. That's the narrative that makes male headship seem natural, divinely ordained, part of the fundamental order of creation. But Lilith's story says something completely different. It says there was another way. It says equality was the original plan. It says a woman refused to submit, and even God couldn't force her to return. It says female autonomy is possible, even if the cost is enormous. And that message is absolutely unacceptable to a patriarchal religious system. So Lilith was relegated to the margins, to folklore and mysticism, to the shadows and the footnotes. She was allowed to exist as a demon, as a monster, as a warning, but not as what she originally was, Adam's equal partner. The mainstream religious tradition simply wrote her out of the story. They went with the version that supported their power structure. And for most of history, that worked. Most people never heard of Lilith. Most people still haven't. But here's the thing about suppressed stories. They don't die. They go underground. They persist in whispers and legends. They show up in unexpected places. They wait. And eventually, when the time is right, they resurface. And that's exactly what happened with Lilith. Throughout the centuries, even as she was pushed to the margins of mainstream religion, Lilith never completely disappeared. She haunted the edges of Western culture, showing up in art and literature, in poetry and paintings, always representing something forbidden, something dangerous, something alluring. Artists and writers, especially those interested in occultism and alternative spirituality, kept her memory alive. During the Romantic period of the late 18th and 19th centuries, when artists and poets were rebelling against Enlightenment rationalism and celebrating emotion, imagination, and the supernatural, Lilith made a comeback. The pre-Raphaelite painters were particularly fascinated by her. Dante Gabriel Rossetti painted Lady Lilith in 1868, showing her as a beautiful, sensual woman admiring herself in a mirror, combing her long, luxurious hair, surrounded by flowers, utterly absorbed in her own beauty and power. She's not a demon in this painting. She's dangerously attractive, narcissistic perhaps, but also magnificent. The painting captures something essential about Lilith, her absolute self-possession, her refusal to define herself in relation to men. John Collier painted Lilith in 1887, showing her as a pale, nude woman wrapped around by a massive serpent set against a dark background. The eroticism is unmistakable, as is the connection to the Serpent of Eden. The painting suggests a conspiracy, an alliance between Lilith and the serpent, the original rebels against divine authority. Poets were equally fascinated. Goethe mentioned Lilith in Faust, describing her as Adam's first wife and warning that her beautiful hair can trap men. Victor Hugo wrote about her. Dante Gabriel Rossetti wrote a poem to accompany his painting. Robert Browning referenced her. These weren't fringe figures. These were major cultural voices, and they were all drawn to Lilith's story. But it's in the 20th century that Lilith's resurrection really accelerates. As women's rights movements gained momentum, as feminists began questioning patriarchal religious structures, as scholars began examining the hidden and suppressed narratives of women's history, Lilith emerged as a powerful symbol. She became, for many, the first feminist, the first woman who refused to accept male dominance, the first rebel against patriarchy. Jewish feminists in particular embraced Lilith. In 1972, a group of Jewish women created a magazine called Lilith, which is still published today, focusing on Jewish women's issues, feminism, and challenging patriarchal interpretations of Jewish tradition. The choice of name was deliberate and provocative. They were reclaiming the demon, reinterpreting her story, seeing in her refusal not evil but courage, not monstrosity but justified rebellion. Academic scholars began studying Lilith more seriously, tracing her origins, examining the texts, and analyzing what her story reveals about ancient attitudes toward female sexuality and autonomy. Books were written, university courses were taught. Lilith entered the academic discourse about gender, religion, and mythology. In popular culture, Lilith exploded. She showed up in movies and television shows, usually as a powerful female demon or supernatural entity. True Blood featured Lilith as the first vampire, the progenitor of all vampires, worshipped as a goddess by vampire fundamentalists. Supernatural, that long-running show about monster hunters, featured Lilith as the first demon, created by Lucifer himself, more powerful than almost any other creature they encountered. The TV show Lucifer made her Lucifer's mother, a cosmic entity of enormous power. She appeared in comic books, especially those dealing with supernatural themes. In the DC Comics universe, she's an ancient sorceress and demon. In Marvel Comics, she's been portrayed as the mother of all demons, tied to various mystical storylines. Video games embraced her too. In the Diablo series, Lilith is a major antagonist, the daughter of Mephisto, one of the prime evils, and the mother of Sanctuary, the world where the games take place. She's portrayed as powerful, dangerous, and complex, not simply evil, but acting according to her own agenda and her own sense of what's necessary. In The Vampire, the Masquerade role-playing game and related media, Lilith is a foundational figure, sometimes portrayed as the first vampire or the source of vampiric power. The entire dark, gothic aesthetic of that game world resonates with Lilith's energy, dangerous female sexuality, rebellion against divine authority, and existing in the shadows of society. Music has been equally influenced. Female rock and metal artists in particular have embraced Lilith's imagery and symbolism. The Lilith Fair, a concert tour featuring female musicians, ran from 1997 to 1999 and was revived briefly in 2010, celebrating female artists and creating a space for women's voices in the male-dominated music industry. The choice of Lilith's name was a statement, connecting modern female artists to that ancient rebel. Individual musicians have written songs about Lilith or adopted her persona. She represents rebellion, sexuality, power, and the refusal to be constrained by societal expectations. For female artists operating in industries that often try to control and sexualize them on male terms, Lilith provides a model for taking control of one's own sexuality and creative power. In modern paganism and occultism, Lilith has become a goddess figure for many practitioners. She's invoked in rituals focused on female empowerment, sexual liberation, protection, and shadow work, the psychological process of integrating the rejected or suppressed parts of oneself. For many modern witches and practitioners of goddess spirituality, Lilith represents the dark feminine, not as evil, but as the fierce, untamed, autonomous aspect of female divinity that patriarchal religions tried to suppress. Some modern Satanist groups, particularly those focused on individualism and the rejection of arbitrary authority rather than literal devil worship, have embraced Lilith as a symbol of their values. The refusal to submit to unjust authority, the assertion of individual autonomy, and the rejection of shame around sexuality, these are core Satanist values, and Lilith embodies them perfectly. But perhaps most importantly, Lilith has become a touchstone for contemporary feminist theology and biblical criticism. Scholars and religious feminists have asked, what does it mean that the woman who demanded equality was written out of the story? What does it tell us about the construction of biblical narratives that the first woman had to be recreated as properly submissive before the story could continue? What would it mean to reclaim Lilith? Not as a demon, but as a hero. Not as a cautionary tale, but as an inspiration. Some feminist theologians have argued that we need to read Lilith's story alongside Eve's story to understand the full picture of women in the biblical tradition. Eve is the woman who obeys initially, but then is tempted and falls, bringing sin into the world, at least according to the traditional interpretation. She's complicit in humanity's downfall because she listened to the serpent and ate the forbidden fruit. But Lilith never falls because she never submits in the first place. She maintains her integrity and autonomy, even at enormous cost. In a way, she's morally superior to both Adam and Eve because she's true to herself. This reinterpretation is radical because it completely flips the traditional narrative. Instead of Lilith being the first sinner, she's the first free woman. Instead of her defiance being evil, it's heroic. Instead of being a warning about what happens to disobedient women, she becomes a model for women who refuse oppression. Now, some people argue that we shouldn't romanticize Lilith. They point out that in the traditional texts, she really is portrayed as genuinely evil, not just rebellious, but murderous, killing babies and seducing men to their doom. They argue that trying to reclaim her as a feminist icon ignores the genuinely dark aspects of her mythology and risks glorifying something actually harmful. This is a fair point, and it brings up important questions about how we interpret ancient myths and what we do with problematic elements in stories we find meaningful. The truth is that Lilith's mythology is complicated and contradictory because it evolved over thousands of years across different cultures, each adding their own layers, their own fears and anxieties, their own attempts to explain suffering and death. But here's what I think is important. We have to ask why Lilith became associated with child murder and sexual danger in the first place. What was the original sin that led to all of that? It was refusing to submit. It was demanding equality. The transformation from Adam's equal partner to child-killing demon is the narrative's way of punishing female autonomy. It's saying, this is what happens to women who won't obey. They become monsters. So when modern feminists reclaim Lilith, they're not necessarily celebrating child murder. They're recognizing that the demonization was unjust, that the original refusal was righteous, and that the punishment was disproportionate and designed to terrify other women into compliance. They're saying, we see what you did there. We see how you turned a woman demanding her rights into a monster, and we're not falling for it anymore. This gets at something really important about mythology and how it functions. Myths aren't just entertaining stories. They're the operating system of culture. They're how societies encode their values, their fears, their power structures, their rules about who gets to have power and who doesn't. And when a myth is designed to keep a group of people in their place, reclaiming and reinterpreting that myth is a radical act. It's not just literary criticism. It's cultural resistance. Let's go deeper into the psychological dimensions of Lilith's story because there's so much richness here about the human psyche, about archetypes, about how we understand the masculine and feminine principles, not just in gender terms, but as fundamental forces in consciousness. Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, wrote extensively about archetypes, universal patterns and symbols that appear across cultures and throughout history, residing in what he called the collective unconscious. He identified the shadow as one of the most important archetypes, representing the parts of ourselves we reject, deny, or repress. The shadow contains everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves, often appearing in dreams and myths as dark or frightening figures. Lilith is a perfect example of a shadow figure, but specifically, she represents what Jungian psychology calls the rejected feminine, the aspects of female being that patriarchal culture cannot accept and must suppress. She embodies female sexuality that exists for its own sake, not in service to men or reproduction. She represents female rage, the fury that comes from oppression and the refusal to accept it. She embodies autonomy, the insistence on being a subject rather than an object, an equal rather than a subordinate. In Jungian terms, the fact that Lilith was written out of the official story and turned into a demon is a classic example of shadow projection. The culture takes what it cannot accept, the autonomous woman, and projects it outward as something evil and other. This is how the shadow works psychologically. We disown parts of ourselves we can't integrate, and then we see them outside ourselves as threats, as enemies, as demons. But Jung also taught that healing and wholeness require integrating the shadow, bringing those rejected parts back into consciousness, acknowledging them, and finding a way to incorporate them into a more complete sense of self. From this perspective, the modern reclamation of Lilith is exactly that kind of integration work. Its culture is beginning to acknowledge and reintegrate the feminine autonomy it rejected, to see it not as demonic, but as a necessary part of the whole. There's also something profound here about the anima and animus, Jung's terms for the feminine aspects of the male psyche and the masculine aspects of the female psyche. Jung believed that men carry an inner image of the feminine, the anima, which influences how they relate to women and to their own emotional and intuitive capacities. When this anima is healthy and integrated, men can relate to women as full human beings and can access their own emotional depth. But when the anima is rejected or feared, it becomes monstrous, and men project that monstrous feminine onto actual women, seeing them as threatening, manipulative, or evil. Lilith, in her demonic form, is a classic negative anima projection. She's the feminine that the male psyche fears and cannot control, so she becomes a night demon, a seductress, a destroyer. The fact that she attacks men in their sleep and steals their seed is particularly revealing. This is about male fear of female sexuality and of their own sexual desire, the fear that the feminine will drain them, deplete them, or control them through sexuality. For women, Lilith can function as a powerful animus figure, representing the aggressive, assertive, boundary-setting aspects of the psyche that women are often socialized to suppress. In a culture that teaches women to be agreeable, submissive, and accommodating, accessing the Lilith energy means finding the ability to say no, to assert boundaries, to claim space and power. It means integrating the parts of themselves that refuse to be nice when niceness means self-erasure. From this psychological perspective, the widespread resonance of Lilith's story today suggests that our culture is in the process of a massive integration of rejected feminine energy. After thousands of years of patriarchal dominance, of female sexuality being controlled and contained, of female autonomy being punished and suppressed, something is shifting. The shadow is rising. The rejected is returning. And Lilith is the symbol of that return. But let's be honest about something. This process is not comfortable for anyone. When the shadow rises, when long-suppressed energies demand recognition, there's always chaos and conflict. We're living through that right now. The battles over women's rights, over bodily autonomy, over representation and power, these are all manifestations of this deeper archetypal struggle. And Lilith is right there in the middle of it, whether people consciously invoke her or not. There's another dimension to explore here, which is Lilith's connection to sexuality itself, not just as a social or political issue, but as a fundamental life force. In many esoteric and mystical traditions, sexuality is understood as a powerful creative and spiritual energy, not separate from the divine, but intimately connected to it. The Song of Songs in the Hebrew Bible is explicitly erotic poetry. Tantric traditions in Hinduism and Buddhism use sexual energy as a path to enlightenment. The sacred marriage rituals in ancient Near Eastern religions involved literal or symbolic sexual union as a way to connect with divine forces. Lilith represents sexuality that exists outside the bounds of approved, sanctified, reproduction-focused marital relations. Her sexuality is wild, autonomous, dangerous, and precisely because of that, it's powerful. It's connected to the chaotic, creative forces of the universe. It's the sexuality that patriarchal religions have spent enormous energy trying to control, regulate, and suppress because uncontrolled sexuality is a threat to social order, to patrilineal inheritance, to male certainty about paternity, to all the structures that depend on controlling women's bodies. In the Kabbalistic texts, there's a fascinating detail. Lilith is sometimes described as the bride of Samuel, the angel of death, but in some traditions, she's also said to be connected to the Shekinah, the feminine aspect of God in Jewish mysticism. The Shekinah is the divine presence, the part of God that dwells with humanity, often gendered as feminine. Some mystical texts suggest that in the broken state of the world, the Shekinah is in exile, separated from the masculine aspects of divinity, and that the healing of the world requires the reunion of masculine and feminine divine principles. Lilith, in this framework, represents the feminine divine in its exiled, rejected, and therefore dangerous state. She's what the Shekinah becomes when she's cast out, denied, and demonized. The fact that she then becomes associated with the demonic realm is not because she's inherently evil, but because rejection and exile twist and corrupt what should be holy. This suggests that the healing of Lilith, the reintegration and reclamation of her energy, is part of the larger healing of the divine feminine itself. This gets into some really deep mystical territory, but it's important because it shows that even within the tradition that demonized Lilith, there are hints and suggestions of a more complex understanding, a recognition that the feminine divine cannot simply be eliminated or suppressed without cosmic consequences. Let's talk about Lilith's children for a moment, because this aspect of her mythology is particularly rich and strange. According to various texts, Lilith gives birth to hundreds of demons every day. These are sometimes called the Lilim or Lilith's children, and they inherit their mother's dangerous qualities. They seduce, they deceive, they harm. They're the offspring of Lilith's union with various demons and fallen angels, particularly Samuel. But here's an interesting question. What do these demon children represent symbolically? One interpretation is that they're the proliferation of chaos and disorder, the way that one act of rebellion spawns countless further disruptions to the established order. Lilith's refusal to submit doesn't just affect her. It creates a lineage of disorder, a genealogy of the rejected and the wild. Another interpretation, more psychological, is that Lilith's children represent all the thoughts, feelings, impulses, and energies that patriarchal consciousness rejects and represses. Every time a woman feels anger but has to smile, every time a woman desires sexual pleasure but is taught to be ashamed, every time a woman wants to assert herself but is socialized into passivity, that rejected energy has to go somewhere. It becomes Lilith's children, demons in the psyche, disruptive forces that can't be eliminated no matter how hard we try. There's also a body horror aspect to Lilith's endless demonic births. She's hyperfertile, constantly reproducing, and her fertility is not blessed or sanctified but monstrous. This connects to deep anxieties about female reproductive power, the fact that women can create life, and that this power is somewhat beyond male control. In patriarchal systems that obsess over paternity and bloodlines, female fertility has to be carefully controlled and regulated. Lilith, giving birth to countless demons, represents the nightmare version of uncontrolled female reproduction. And then there's the tragic element. Remember that according to the story, God or the angels decreed that 100 of Lilith's children would die every day as punishment for her refusal to return to Adam. Lilith is thus condemned to eternal loss, to birthing children knowing they will die, to maternal grief without end. This is one of the cruelest aspects of her curse. She's not just exiled and demonized. She's forced into a cycle of creation and destruction, life and death, forever. Some feminist readers have seen in this an allegory for women's experience under patriarchy, constantly creating, nurturing, and laboring, only to have the fruits of that labor destroyed, devalued, or taken away. The endless cycle of Lilith's births and losses mirrors the way patriarchal systems exploit female labor, both reproductive and otherwise, while giving women little control over the outcomes. But we should also consider the possibility that Lilith's demonic children represent something more positive, or at least more complex, from an alternative perspective. If we read Lilith as the first rebel, the first individual to refuse unjust authority, then her children are the lineage of rebels, disruptors, and free thinkers who follow in her footsteps. They're the artists, activists, mystics, and revolutionaries who refuse to accept the world as it is, who imagine alternatives, who make trouble for established powers. From this angle, being one of Lilith's children is not a curse but an honor. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of Lilith's story, her absolute refusal to be a victim. Yes, she's punished. Yes, she's exiled, demonized, and cursed. Yes, she loses her children every day. But she never submits. She never returns. She never apologizes or begs for forgiveness. She maintains her autonomy and her dignity no matter what the cost. And this is what makes her so powerful as a symbol. In a world full of stories where female characters are rescued by men, where their value comes from being chosen by the hero, where their happy ending is marriage and domesticity, Lilith stands alone. She doesn't need to be rescued because she rescued herself. She doesn't wait for permission to leave. She doesn't define herself in relation to Adam. She's not anybody's helper, anybody's companion, anybody's reward. She's herself, fully and uncompromisingly. This is threatening to patriarchal narratives in a way that's hard to overstate. The entire structure of those narratives depends on women being relational, being defined by their connections to men, fathers, husbands, and sons. A woman who exists entirely on her own terms, who is complete in herself, who doesn't need male validation or approval, breaks the whole system. She proves that the system is optional, that women can exist outside of it, and that realization is explosive. Now let's address something important. Throughout this exploration, we've been largely talking about Lilith in the context of heterosexual, cisgender frameworks because that's the context in which her mythology developed. But Lilith's resonance extends far beyond those boundaries. In LGBTQ+ communities, particularly among queer women and non-binary folks, Lilith has become an important symbol for different reasons, but equally powerful ones. For queer people, Lilith represents the refusal of compulsory heterosexuality and traditional gender roles. Her rejection of Adam can be read as a rejection of heterosexual marriage as the only acceptable life path. Her autonomy represents the possibility of defining one's own sexuality and relationships outside of societal norms. Her demonization mirrors the way queer people have been demonized, pathologized, and pushed to the margins of society for refusing to conform. Some queer interpretations of Lilith even suggest that her refusal of Adam was not just about equality, but about fundamental incompatibility. Maybe Lilith simply wasn't attracted to Adam. Maybe the problem wasn't just about power dynamics, but about desire itself. This reading opens up interesting possibilities and connects Lilith to a long lineage of queer figures who exist outside the reproductive, heterosexual narrative. Trans and non-binary folks have also found meaning in Lilith's story. Her existence in liminal spaces, neither fully human nor fully demon, neither in Eden nor in any conventional realm, resonates with the experience of existing outside the gender binary. Her refusal to conform to the role assigned to her at creation mirrors the trans experience of rejecting assigned categories. Her transformation from woman to demon can be read as a kind of becoming, a choosing of one's own nature over society's expectations. The point is that Lilith's power as a symbol is not limited to any single interpretation or community. She contains multitudes. She can mean different things to different people while maintaining her core essence, autonomy, refusal, and the courage to pay the price for freedom. This multiplicity is itself part of her power. She can't be pinned down, categorized, or controlled. She slips out of every box we try to put her in. Let's turn our attention now to a question that might have been nagging at you throughout this entire exploration. Is any of this real? Did Lilith actually exist? Was she really Adam's first wife? Or is this all just mythology, folklore, and later embellishment? The answer depends on what you mean by real. If you mean, is there historical evidence that a woman named Lilith lived in the Garden of Eden with Adam? Then no, of course not. The Garden of Eden itself is a mythological narrative, not a historical location. Adam and Eve are symbolic figures representing humanity, not historical individuals whose lives can be documented. But mythology is real in a different and arguably more important way. Myths are psychologically real. They're culturally real. They express truths about human experience, about how we understand ourselves, our relationships, our place in the cosmos. They encode the values, fears, and hopes of the cultures that create them. And in that sense, Lilith is absolutely real. She's real as a symbol that has persisted for thousands of years across multiple cultures. She's real as a figure that people have believed in, prayed about, and protected themselves against. She's real in the amulets that anxious parents hung over their children's beds. She's real in the art and literature she's inspired. She's real in the meaning that millions of people have found in her story. She's real in the conversations we're having right now about gender, power, autonomy, and resistance. From a historical critical perspective, we can trace how Lilith's mythology developed. We can see the Mesopotamian roots, the evolution through Jewish folklore, the medieval elaborations, the modern reinterpretations. We can identify the texts where she appears and the cultural context that shaped those texts. This scholarly work is valuable because it shows us how myths evolve, how they respond to changing social conditions, how different eras project their anxieties and aspirations onto ancient symbols. But the scholarly perspective shouldn't obscure the lived reality that Lilith has represented for people throughout history. For a medieval Jewish mother terrified that her baby would die in the night, Lilith was horrifyingly real. For a 19th century poet grappling with questions about sexuality and rebellion, Lilith was inspiringly real. For a modern feminist theologian challenging patriarchal interpretations of Scripture, Lilith is politically and spiritually real. The question of Lilith's reality also touches on deeper questions about Scripture, canon, and religious authority. Why is the Genesis account of Adam and Eve canonical? Part of the accepted biblical text that billions of people consider divinely inspired, while the story of Adam and Lilith is relegated to apocrypha, folklore, and mysticism. Who decided what was scripture and what wasn't? What criteria did they use? And how might those criteria have been influenced by the power structures and biases of the people making those decisions? These are not simple questions, and religious traditions have complex and varied answers. But it's worth noting that the process of canon formation, deciding which texts are authoritative scripture and which aren't, was a human process carried out by particular people in particular historical contexts with particular perspectives and agendas. The texts that ended up in the biblical canon are not the only texts that ancient Jewish and Christian communities considered sacred or important. There were many other texts, many other stories, many other traditions that didn't make the cut. Some of these texts were excluded because they contradicted the emerging Orthodox understanding of theology. Some were excluded because they were considered too mystical or too difficult for ordinary believers to interpret correctly. And some, we might reasonably suspect, were excluded because they contained ideas that threatened the power structures of the religious and political authorities doing the excluding. Lilith's story, with its assertion of female equality and its portrait of a woman who defies God himself and gets away with it, is exactly the kind of story that wouldn't make it into a canon being shaped by male religious authorities in patriarchal societies. It's too dangerous. It gives women ideas. It suggests that the established order is not the only possible order, that things could be different. So while Lilith's story didn't make it into the official Bible, it survived in other ways, in the margins, in the commentaries, in the folklore, in the mystical traditions. And perhaps that marginal status actually protected it in some ways. Because it wasn't canonical, it wasn't as rigidly controlled. It could evolve more freely. It could be reinterpreted and reclaimed more easily. The very fact that it was suppressed made it more available for subversive rereadings. This pattern, where suppressed and marginalized narratives turn out to contain essential truths that the dominant narrative excludes, is repeated throughout history. It's why recovering lost and suppressed stories is so important. It's why scholars dig through ancient manuscripts and fragments. It's why folklorists collect oral traditions before they're forgotten. Because the stories that get told, the ones that are officially sanctioned and widely known, are never the whole story. There are always other voices, other perspectives, other versions of events that didn't fit the official narrative. Lilith is one of those other voices. She speaks from the shadows and the margins. And increasingly, people are listening. Let's explore how Lilith's image and symbolism have been used in visual art throughout history, because this reveals a lot about how different eras understood her. In medieval Jewish manuscripts, Lilith occasionally appears in illustrations, usually as a demonic figure, sometimes with wings, sometimes with animalistic features. These images served as warnings, visual reminders of the spiritual dangers lurking in the world. But it's in the 19th century that Lilith really explodes as a visual subject in Western art. The Romantic and pre-Raphaelite movements were fascinated by femme fatale, beautiful but dangerous women, and Lilith fit perfectly into this category. The paintings we mentioned earlier, Rossetti's and Collier's, are prime examples, but they're part of a much larger trend. These paintings typically show Lilith as extraordinarily beautiful, often nude or partially clothed, usually with long, luxurious hair, which itself is symbolically significant. In many traditions, women's hair is associated with sexuality and is supposed to be covered or controlled. Lilith's flowing, wild hair represents uncontrolled sexuality. She's often shown in natural settings, connecting her to the wilderness and to the untamed aspects of nature. The serpent appears frequently, sometimes wrapped around her body, sometimes just present in the scene, reminding viewers of her connection to the Eden narrative and to the forces of temptation. What's interesting is that these paintings are clearly meant to be seen as dangerous and seductive, but they're also incredibly beautiful and compelling. The artists are warning viewers about the danger of the femme fatale, but they're also clearly fascinated and attracted. The paintings reveal the ambivalence, the simultaneous fear and desire that figures like Lilith provoke in the male imagination. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Lilith's visual representation shifts dramatically. Female artists begin depicting her, and their perspective is obviously different. Instead of being the object of male fear and desire, she becomes a subject, a symbol of female power and autonomy. Contemporary feminist artists portray Lilith as strong, defiant, angry, and proud. She's not being looked at. She's looking back. She's not a passive object of the gaze, but an active agent of her own story. Some contemporary depictions emphasize Lilith's rage, showing her with fierce expressions, aggressive postures, flames, or storms surrounding her. These images tap into female anger, the justified fury of thousands of years of oppression, and present it not as something to be ashamed of, but as righteous and powerful. Other contemporary depictions emphasize Lilith's sexuality, but in a very different way from the 19th century paintings. Instead of being dangerous to men, her sexuality is portrayed as belonging to herself, as a source of her own power and pleasure. She's not seducing men to their doom. She's simply existing in her full sexual being, unburdened by shame or the need for male approval. Some artists portray Lilith with other women, suggesting lesbian readings of her sexuality or simply emphasizing female solidarity and the idea that women don't need men to be complete. Some show her with children, not harming them but protecting them, reclaiming the mother aspect that was perverted into the child killer demon. There's also been a trend in recent years of women getting Lilith tattoos. These range from simple symbols, like the astrological symbols sometimes associated with Lilith, to elaborate portraits of Lilith in various forms. Women choose these tattoos as personal statements about their own autonomy, their refusal to be controlled, their reclamation of their sexuality and power. The tattoo is a way of literally inscribing Lilith's story onto their own bodies, making her symbolism a permanent part of their identity. In graphic novels and comics, Lilith appears frequently, and these visual narratives allow for complex storytelling about her character. Some portray her as a villain, continuing the traditional demonization but with more psychological depth. Others portray her as an anti-hero or even a hero, fighting against genuinely evil forces, even if her methods are dark. The visual medium allows artists to explore the full range of her mythology, from ancient Mesopotamia to modern urban fantasy settings. The diversity of visual representations of Lilith reflects the diversity of interpretations of her story. She's multifaceted, containing contradictions, and visual artists across centuries have tried to capture different aspects of her nature. What's consistent is that she's compelling. Whether portrayed as a demon or a goddess, monster or hero, she commands attention. You can't look away. And that in itself tells you something about her power. Now, we need to talk about something that might make some people uncomfortable: the appropriation and commercialization of Lilith's image and story. As Lilith has become more widely known and embraced, especially in feminist and alternative spirituality communities, her image has also been commodified. You can buy Lilith jewelry, Lilith tarot decks, Lilith artwork, and Lilith statues. There are Lilith workshops and Lilith rituals. Some of this is created by people with a genuine connection to the tradition and real reverence for the symbol. But some of it is just capitalism doing what capitalism does, taking anything that becomes popular and turning it into a product. This raises questions about respect, authenticity, and who has the right to interpret and use sacred or mythological symbols. These are not easy questions, and different people will have different answers based on their own relationships to the traditions involved. For people from Jewish backgrounds, Lilith is part of their ancestral spiritual heritage. She comes from Jewish texts and folklore, even if she was marginalized within that tradition. When Jewish feminists reclaim Lilith, they're reclaiming something from their own tradition, reinterpreting their own mythology. That's different from someone with no connection to Judaism adopting Lilith simply because they think she's cool or empowering. That said, symbols and myths do travel across cultures and evolve as they go. Lilith herself traveled from ancient Mesopotamia to Jewish folklore to Christian mysticism, to modern paganism, to popular culture. At each stage, she was reinterpreted and adapted. Is there a point at which this natural evolution becomes appropriation? Does it matter whether the people engaging with the symbol do so with respect and understanding or just superficially? These are conversations worth having, and they apply not just to Lilith but to many spiritual and mythological figures from various traditions. The key is probably respect, education, and awareness of the origins and context of the symbols we engage with. If someone wants to work with Lilith as a spiritual symbol, taking the time to actually learn her mythology, understand the historical context, and engage with depth rather than just slapping her name on products seems like a minimum requirement. There's also the question of how Lilith's story intersects with other systems of oppression beyond gender. Lilith's narrative is fundamentally about gender and patriarchy, but we live in a world where oppressions intersect and compound. How does Lilith's story speak to or fail to speak to the experiences of women of color, of poor women, of disabled women, of women in non-Western cultures? This is a complex question because Lilith's mythology comes from ancient Near Eastern and Jewish sources, which have their own specific cultural contexts. The universalizing of her story as the story of all women's oppression can erase important differences in how different groups of women experience patriarchy and have resisted it. At the same time, the core themes of Lilith's story, refusal of domination, assertion of autonomy, and the price paid for freedom, resonate across different contexts. Women from many different backgrounds have found meaning in her story, seeing their own experiences reflected in her rebellion and punishment. The key is probably to hold both truths simultaneously. Lilith's story comes from a specific context and should be understood in that context. And the themes it explores have broader relevance that allows people from different backgrounds to find meaning in it. The danger is in assuming that Lilith's story is the only story or the universal story, when in fact every culture has its own stories of female rebellion, of women who refuse to submit, of the conflict between patriarchal order and female autonomy. Let me share some of these parallel stories briefly because they're important and because seeing the pattern across cultures reinforces how fundamental this struggle is. In Greek mythology, there's Medusa, once a beautiful woman who was raped by Poseidon in Athena's temple and then punished by Athena by being transformed into a monster with snakes for hair whose gaze turns men to stone. She's killed by the hero Perseus, and her severed head becomes a weapon. But feminist reinterpretations have asked, who's the real monster in this story? The woman who was violated and then punished for it? Or the gods who blamed her for her own assault? And the hero who murdered her? There's Medea from Greek mythology and Euripides' play, a woman who helps the hero Jason achieve his quest, only to be abandoned by him for a more politically advantageous marriage. In revenge, she kills their children, a horrifying act that's been read as the ultimate refusal of her role as wife and mother in a world where those are the only roles available to women. She chooses destruction over submission. In Mesopotamian mythology, there's Ishtar or Inanna, the goddess of love and war, sexuality and violence, who descends to the underworld and whose mythology includes her dominating male gods and kings, refusing to be controlled by them. She's a divine figure, but her stories grapple with similar themes of female power and sexuality existing on their own terms. In Hindu mythology, there's Kali, the fierce goddess often depicted with a garland of skulls, tongue out, standing on her husband Shiva's body, dancing in a cremation ground. She's terrifying, bloody, and uncontrolled, representing the destructive aspect of the divine feminine. She destroys demons, but she also threatens order itself with her wild fury. And yet she's worshipped, revered, understood as necessary, and even protective. In Japanese folklore, there are the Ana, female demons or spirits, often women who died in anguish and rage and returned as vengeful ghosts. Stories like that of Oiwa or Okiku, women who were wronged, murdered, and betrayed, and who come back to haunt and punish those who harmed them. In Celtic and Irish mythology, there's the Morrigan, the goddess of war, fate, and death, often appearing as a crow, a terrifying and powerful figure who influences the outcomes of battles, not through brute strength, but through magic, prophecy, and shape-shifting. She's not controlled by any god or man. She serves her own purposes. The pattern repeats across cultures. Powerful women, women who assert sexuality or autonomy, women who refuse to stay in their assigned places, become monsters, demons, dangers. They're killed, punished, or relegated to the underworld. But their stories survive because they represent something that can't be completely suppressed: female power, rage, autonomy, and the refusal to accept oppression. Lilith is one expression of this universal pattern, but she's not the only one. And understanding her story in dialogue with these other stories enriches both. It shows that the struggle she represents is not unique to one tradition, but is a fundamental human theme that every culture has grappled with in its own way. As we move toward the conclusion of this exploration, I want to address what might be the most important question of all. What do we do with Lilith now? How do we engage with her story in the 21st century? What does she have to teach us? For some people, Lilith remains a religious or spiritual figure, whether as a demon to be protected against in traditional contexts or as a goddess or power to be invoked in alternative spiritual practices. For these folks, Lilith is not just a symbol, but an entity, a presence, something that can be related to, prayed to, worked with. This is a valid and deeply personal way of engaging with her story. For others, Lilith is primarily a mythological and psychological symbol, representing aspects of the human experience, particularly the female experience, that are important to acknowledge and integrate. This approach doesn't require belief in Lilith as a literal being, but recognizes the power of her story to illuminate truths about human nature, society, and the psyche. For still others, Lilith is a cultural and political symbol, representing feminist resistance to patriarchy, the assertion of female autonomy and equality, and the refusal to accept systems of domination. This approach focuses on what Lilith's story reveals about power structures and how it can inspire contemporary activism and social change. All of these approaches have value, and they're not mutually exclusive. Someone can engage with Lilith on multiple levels simultaneously, finding spiritual meaning, psychological insight, and political inspiration all in the same story. What Lilith teaches us, regardless of how we approach her, is that there is always an alternative to submission. There is always the possibility of refusal. There is always another way, even if it comes at enormous cost. She teaches that autonomy and dignity are worth fighting for, that being true to yourself is more important than security or acceptance, and that saying no is a fundamental right. She also teaches about the mechanisms of oppression, how systems of power respond to those who challenge them. They demonize. They erase. They turn rebels into cautionary tales. They transform the refusal of domination into monstrosity. Understanding these mechanisms helps us recognize them when we see them operating in our own world, in our own time. Lilith's story is a reminder that history is written by those in power, that the official narratives are never complete, and that there are always suppressed voices and hidden stories. She reminds us to ask who benefits from the stories we're told, what alternative narratives might exist, and what we might discover if we look in the margins and the shadows. In a time when women's rights are under renewed attack in many parts of the world, when bodily autonomy is threatened, when there are ongoing battles over equality and representation, Lilith's ancient refusal feels incredibly relevant. She stands as a reminder that these battles are not new, that women have been resisting patriarchy for as long as patriarchy has existed, and that despite thousands of years of suppression and punishment, the resistance continues. But here's something crucial. Lilith's story is also a warning about the cost of resistance. She pays an enormous price for her refusal. Exile, demonization, the eternal loss of her children, the transformation from human to monster in the cultural imagination. This is not a romanticized, cost-free rebellion. This is a clear-eyed acknowledgement that challenging power comes with consequences, sometimes terrible ones. And yet she does it anyway. And that's what makes her heroic, if we choose to read her as a hero. She knows the cost, and she refuses anyway because some things are more important than safety. Some things are worth suffering for. Your dignity, your autonomy, your right to say no. Different people will take different lessons from this. Some will be inspired to take the risks, to pay the costs, to refuse despite the consequences. Others will recognize that sometimes survival requires compromise, that not everyone is in a position to be Lilith, and that there's no shame in doing what you need to do to survive. Both of these responses are valid. The important thing is that Lilith's story gives us a model for thinking about these choices, for understanding what's at stake, for recognizing the full dimensions of the dilemma. One more thing Lilith's story does, and this might be the most important, is that it gives voice to female rage. For thousands of years, women have been taught that anger is unbecoming, unladylike, unacceptable. That good women don't get angry. That anger makes you ugly, bitter, hysterical. That you should smile, be nice, not make a fuss, and keep the peace. Lilith is pure rage. She refuses, she rebels, she becomes a destroyer in the mythology. And while the traditional texts present this as proof of her evil, modern readers can see it differently. That rage is justified. That fury is an appropriate response to oppression. There is something healthy and necessary about refusing to suppress your anger when anger is the correct emotional response to injustice. This doesn't mean that violence or destruction are the answer. It means that acknowledging rage, feeling it, expressing it, and using it as fuel for change, these are valid and important. Lilith gives women permission to be angry. She says it's okay to not be nice when niceness means accepting your own oppression. She models that sometimes disruption is necessary, that sometimes you have to break things to create space for something new. In trauma therapy, there's a concept called healthy aggression, the ability to assert boundaries, to say no, to protect yourself, to claim space. For people, especially women, who have been socialized to be passive and accommodating, learning to access healthy aggression is often a crucial part of healing. Lilith embodies that healthy aggression taken to its mythological extreme. She's the patron saint of boundary setting, the goddess of no. As we reach the end of this journey through Lilith's mythology, history, and meaning, I want to leave you with some final thoughts. Lilith's story has survived for thousands of years because it touches something essential in human experience: the desire for freedom, the refusal to accept unjust authority, the assertion of autonomy and dignity. The price paid for these things: the rage that comes from oppression, the terror that female power provokes in patriarchal systems, the need to integrate what has been rejected and suppressed. Whether you see Lilith as a demon, a goddess, an archetype, a symbol, or simply as a powerful story, she has something to teach. She reminds us that the narratives we're given are not the only possible narratives. She shows us what happens to those who refuse to comply with unjust systems. She embodies the wild, untamed, autonomous feminine that patriarchal cultures have tried to suppress for millennia. And increasingly, in our time, she's being reclaimed, reinterpreted, and celebrated. Her story is being retold from new perspectives. Her image is being recreated by artists who see in her not a monster, but a hero. Her symbolism is being used by people fighting for justice, equality, and liberation. The demon is being transformed back into the equal partner she was at the beginning. The circle is closing. The suppressed is returning. The shadow is being integrated. This process is not complete, and it won't be easy. The forces that demonized Lilith in the first place are still operating. The structures that depend on female subjugation are still in place. The battles she represents symbolically are still being fought in the real world. But something is shifting. The story is changing. And Lilith, after thousands of years in the wilderness, is coming home. So what do you do with all of this? That's up to you. Maybe you'll see Lilith as a spiritual ally, someone to invoke when you need courage to set boundaries or assert yourself. Maybe you'll see her as a psychological symbol, representing the parts of yourself you've been taught to reject but need to integrate. Maybe you'll see her as a political symbol, inspiring you to resist systems of oppression and fight for equality. Maybe you'll see her as just a fascinating story that reveals hidden dimensions of religious history and mythology. However you choose to engage with Lilith, you're now part of a tradition that stretches back thousands of years. You're connected to ancient Mesopotamian priestesses, to medieval Jewish mothers protecting their children, to Renaissance painters, to romantic poets, to 20th century feminists, to modern witches and activists and artists. You're part of the ongoing conversation about what Lilith means, who she is, and what her story teaches us. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find yourself thinking differently about the stories you've been told, the narratives you've accepted without question, the systems you've assumed were natural and inevitable. Because that's what Lilith does. She makes you question. She makes you wonder what else might have been erased, suppressed, or rewritten. She makes you look for the voices that have been silenced and the stories that have been hidden. That's her gift. Not just her own story, powerful as it is, but the awareness that there are always other stories, other perspectives, other truths waiting to be discovered in the margins and the shadows. And once you start looking for them, once you develop eyes to see what's been hidden, you can never unsee it. The world becomes richer, more complex, more full of possibilities. And maybe more full of hope too. Because if these stories could survive thousands of years of suppression, if they could persist in the shadows and emerge again in new forms, then maybe nothing is ever truly lost. Maybe every suppressed voice, every erased story, every rejected truth is just waiting for the right moment to return. Lilith waited thousands of years. She was patient. And now, in our time, in our world, she's speaking again, louder than ever. And people are listening. Are you? If this journey into Lilith's forbidden story has opened your eyes to the hidden narratives of history, if it's made you question the stories you thought you knew, then I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because there are so many more suppressed stories to uncover, so many more myths that reveal truths about human nature and society, so many more deep dives into the mythology and folklore that shape our world. Leave a comment and tell me what you think about Lilith's story. Do you see her as a demon or a hero? Monster or rebel? What other mythological figures would you like me to explore? What hidden stories do you want brought into the light? And share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who would benefit from Lilith's message of autonomy and refusal. Share it with someone who loves mythology, history, or feminist perspectives on ancient texts. Share it with someone who just needs to know that resistance is possible, that refusal is an option, that there have always been those who said no to unjust authority. Lilith's story survived for thousands of years because people kept telling it, kept passing it down, kept finding meaning in it despite all attempts to erase it. By watching this video, by engaging with this material, by sharing it, you're continuing that tradition. You're keeping the story alive. You're part of the ongoing resurrection of the suppressed feminine, the reclamation of the rejected, the integration of the shadow. Thank you for taking this journey with me into the darkness and the wilderness where Lilith dwells. Thank you for having the courage to question the narratives and look at the uncomfortable truths. Thank you for being part of this community that values depth, complexity, and the recovery of lost stories. Remember, there's always another story beneath the story you've been told. There's always a deeper truth waiting in the shadows. And sometimes, the figures that scare us the most, the ones we've been taught to fear and reject, are the ones with the most important lessons to teach us. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and never stop looking for the voices that have been silenced. Because those voices, Lilith's voice, might be trying to tell you something you desperately need to hear.